so much for inviting me to talk today and for that wonderful introduction. That was very beneficial. As we were saying, so my specialization is primarily focused on autism spectrum disorders, and so that's where I'm interested in neurodiversity, but specifically ASD. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I am what's called a Board-Certified Behavior Analyst. If any of you are interested ever in working with individuals diagnosed with ASD, please feel free to talk to me. This is Board-Certified Behavior Analyst, or BCBA, is the certification that you need to design applied behavior analysis interventions for individuals on the spectrum, or actually a wide variety of individuals, but primarily individuals on the spectrum. So if you're ever interested in pursuing anything related to that, whether it's clinical, I do have clinical experience, although my heart really does lie in research, and that's why I'm a professor, so I can teach and do research and share what I have learned with everyone. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. Please feel free to interrupt if you have questions. There will also be time for questions at the end. All right. So I'm going to start by giving a very brief introduction to what I mean when I say behavioral variability. And I'm focusing on play variability for this set of studies, but my research interests are in behavioral variability as a whole. So we're going to talk about what exactly it is, why it's useful to study, and most importantly to my research, how it is learned. Generally, behavioral variability is considered to be adaptive. So if we think from kind of a more evolutionary perspective, it's important for organisms to be able to behave variably. So imagine that we have maybe a squirrel foraging for food. If they go to the same place over and over every single time, even if it does have nuts from time to time, if they only go to that one place, eventually they're probably going to deplete the resources there. And so importantly, that squirrel needs to be able to vary the locations in which they do search for food. So they can go to the one that works out most of the time, but inevitably when it doesn't have food, they need to be able to vary their behavior and try other places and try other things. And likewise, if we have predators, for instance, who are trying to capture prey, they're probably going to have to get a little bit creative with how they use different hunting maneuvers to try to capture their prey, whether it's trying more ambush strategies or varying that. They're probably going to be more successful if they can vary those responses. Prey, as well, are probably going to be more successful at evading capture if they can vary their behavior too, so that they can be more unpredictable and more likely to escape in that sense. So if we think just from an evolutionary perspective, that ability to behave variably is something that we tend to think of as adaptive. In humans, in our human society, we value variability in behavior as well. And so this manifests in a lot of different ways. This is art, right? We value behavioral variability in terms of art. We don't like just looking at the same picture over and over. We like to see lots of different, if just focusing on paintings, for instance, we like to look at very different paintings with different styles, different subjects of the paintings, and we get really excited when we see a painting that's been done in a unique style that we've never really seen before. We tend to value artwork that is original and creative, whether it's music, writing, all areas kind of art where we look for originality and we look for creativity. This is also really important in terms of problem solving, kind of on a day-to-day basis. So you can think about if you lose your keys, happens to me all the time, you probably, the first place you will look is the place that you normally put your keys, right? And so you probably have a place where you're most likely to drop them. But importantly, if you look there and they're not there, you have to be able to get creative in where you're looking. And so, yeah, you might look right around it, or you might look, okay, imagine I just got home, where did I go? Maybe I went somewhere different, or I took off my jacket somewhere different. So you have to be able to problem solve that way, and you have to be able to do lots of different things to see what's going to work out. Because a specific behavior is not always going to work out in every situation. We're going to be most successful if we can vary. And finally, variability is really critical for social interaction. So imagine just on a day-to-day basis how we interact with each other socially when we have conversations. We don't talk about the same thing over and over. We talk about different topics. Even when we're talking about the same topics, we're searching for new things to say. Those sorts of interactions are where we build those social relationships and where we learn new things and share new ideas with each other. Generally, in our society, we place a high value on behavioral variability and creativity and those things. One thing to note is it is not necessarily always adaptive to behave variably. So you shouldn't just go into every situation and do lots of random things or different things. There are some situations in which it is actually much better to behave more repetitively. So think if you're in a classroom, right, there's a set of behaviors that you're expected to do, right? You're expected to sit, take notes, ask questions, answer questions. If you go beyond that too much, if you're running around the classroom, things like that, it's probably going to get disruptive. But then there are other situations, like if you've got a kid who's on the playground playing, where you're wide open. There's a lot of different behaviors that you can engage in, and each one is going to have its own value. So that's one of the most important things that we will talk about today, is learning when to behave variably and when not to, because that's going to be critical as well. My focus is in a field called behavior analysis, and if you aren't familiar with this, the idea of behaviorism, B.F. Skinner, if you've ever taken a psychology class, probably you have at least a little bit of background there. That's kind of what founded modern day applied behavior analysis, which is kind of what I focus on. The point is that in behavior analysis, we have this concept that we call reinforcement. And this is probably the most important concept in terms of understanding why we do the things that we do. So our definition of reinforcement is when you do something, something good happens to you, and you do that thing again in the future. So a reinforcer is something that you get to access, and it's going to make you more likely to do what you were just doing again in the future. We study this in humans, of course, but also in non-human animals like rats. So if we have a rat who is in a little operant chamber, they can press a lever with their paw, and it will produce a food pellet. That's going to be considered a reinforcer. They press a pellet, they get access to food. What are they going to do? They're most likely going to go back to that lever and press it again. And the more we deliver food, the more we keep doing this. If you were gambling, if you were playing on a slot machine and you pull the slot and you win really big, probably you're going to stay at this machine. Some people describe that experience differently. Some people say, oh, this machine's lucky. But what we know is that behavior tends to increase when it's reinforced. And you tend to get more repetitive. You're doing the same thing. So the question that we're left with is, repetition is sometimes important and sometimes the way we should behave, and reinforcement is a great way to teach that. But when it's not, when it would actually be better for us to be behaving variably, randomly, originally, creatively, if we're solving problems, how do we teach that skill? Because that's really important as well. And the way we usually think about reinforcement, it doesn't really work with variability. If you get a reinforcer, you're going to do the same thing. You're not going to go do something else. So that's my big question, is how can we learn behavioral variability? This is a concept called reinforced behavioral variability, and that refers to the fact that it is learned over time. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that's been conducted on this concept of reinforced behavioral variability. One of the first studies that was done showing this concept was done by Pryor and colleagues, 1969, I know that's a while ago, but this was done with porpoises. And so this was a porpoise trainer. And what they were interested in is whether they could get the porpoises to do a wider range of tricks. And so this is in a setting where if the porpoises are doing a wider variety of tricks, we're probably going to get more audience engagement, and it's just going to be kind of better for everybody involved. But the question is, how do you teach a porpoise how to do some crazy new trick? And it's very difficult. You can't really show the porpoise what to do, right? Because that's different. So what they did was essentially they gave the porpoises fish or whatever it is that they wanted to eat when they did a trick that they had never done before. So maybe the first time it was like a somersault in the air, and they got a fish. Now if they did a somersault again, they would not get a fish. They would not get a reward at all. But if they splashed their tail in the water instead, then they would get a reward. Now if they repeated that, they wouldn't. What they had to do was keep doing something different to keep getting rewards. And turns out the porpoises got very good at this. We're doing hundreds of new tricks and combinations of tricks, so it's not just a flip, it's a flip and a kick or a splash with your fins, all of that. So those sorts of combinations came up. And it turns out they write in their paper that they had seen these porpoises do behaviors that nobody had ever seen in a porpoise before. And so that was really important to the area that I'm interested in, because this is an example of learned variability where we taught the porpoise, well I didn't, but they taught the porpoises to behave variably using reinforcement, which, as I just told you, kind of goes against the way that we usually think about reinforcement. Turns out if you reinforce only when they do something different, they will learn to do something different, and they will become very good at it. This has been shown as well in pigeons, in rats. I've done some work with pigeons and rats in the past. I'm really interested in kind of translational research, so thinking about things that we see in the basic lab. I'm also really interested in how we apply those to everyday settings, to clinical settings, and how we see that sort of parallel happen. That same idea that I just talked about that was used in animals has also been shown in humans. It's been shown in a wide variety of humans. I'm just going to focus on children specifically because that's what's most relevant for my research. Different researchers have shown this with different kinds of verbal behavior, so vocalizations, requesting certain items, or finishing sentences. So the prompt might be, tell the name of a vegetable, and you have to give lots of different names of vegetables. And turns out, again, if you provide reinforcement, whether it's praise or sometimes it's a little piece of candy, whatever the kid is looking for in that moment, if you give a reinforcer when they give a different response than what they usually do, we will get very variable responses, and we will get very high levels of behavioral variability is how we talk about it. This has also been shown in play behavior, which I will touch on more. That's sort of where I focus. It's also been shown in activity selection, so think in terms of classroom activities, but what I think is even more interesting is leisure activities, so like the things that you do for fun. So if we have kids who have lots of choices of things you can do for fun, I'm sort of like this too, but a lot of people will kind of pick the same thing over and over again, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. You can pick the same thing over and over again if that's your favorite thing to do. But if you only ever do that, if you never try anything else, you're probably going to be missing out on some opportunities for things that you might actually love, but you never tried it. And so one thing that they've tried is to encourage more variable choices of what to do in your free time. And if you can encourage those choices, you might try things that you don't like, and that's okay, but you're also going to try some things that you do like, and so that can help long-term be beneficial for you. Yes?
Have there been any studies that have shown that it has expanded the retention of like neural pathways?
I don't know of any specifically. In terms of, we don't fully understand, I guess, the neural mechanisms at this point of behavioral variability, but I think that's a really important area for research. There is some neuroscience research that is, nobody's really directly answered that question, but I think probably in the future we will get closer to that.
Okay.
That's a very good question, yeah. All right, so this leads me into, starts to lead me into my research, but before I actually tell you about my project, I gotta give you a definition because I'm gonna use this term. This is a lag schedule. What this means, that's just the procedure that I'm going to use to reinforce variability in my subjects. A lag schedule is kind of like what I was just describing before, where you have to do a certain behavior, a behavior that you have not done recently. And that's how you get a reinforcer. So every time you behave, whether it's the porpoise, whether it is somebody answering a question about, tell me the name of a vegetable, every single response that you make, we're going to compare it to your recent responses. And if it's different, we'll reinforce it. If it's the same, we won't. So just as an example, let's say we behave a certain way, and then we behave the same way again. We would not reinforce that if you repeat the same behavior twice in a row. However, if we switch it up and we do something different, something new, we would reinforce that behavior. If you do something new again, we would definitely reinforce that behavior as well. Oops, sorry. And what's interesting is now, if I go back to a behavior I've done before, but I haven't done it recently, that would still be eligible for reinforcement too. Because you don't have to do brand new things. At some point, you're going to run out of new things to do, right? So it's okay to sometimes repeat things that you've done before. The key with a lag schedule is that you have not done it recently. So as long as it's different than your last response, we would consider that for reinforcement. Okay. So, thinking about what populations might struggle with behavioral variability, this gets me into the areas of research that I'm most interested in. There's a concept of neurodiversity. Some of you might be familiar with this concept, some of you might not, that's okay. Essentially, this term refers to the natural variation that exists in terms of our brain function and in terms of our behavior. So just like we have differences across people in our skin color, in our gender, in our height, in our eye color, we also have variation in the way that we behave. And that's completely normal from a biological perspective to have that kind of variation. Now, some variations, so some we would call neurodivergent populations, their behavior or their brain function is different than the norm in a way that might sometimes make their life a little bit harder because of the way that our society is designed. So somebody in that category where their brain function is different than typical, we would call neurodivergent. If your brain function is more similar to the average, we would call that neurotypical. So those are some terms that I'm going to use, and they're really wide variety. Types of neurodiversity include some of these that are listed up here. You can see a huge variation. My focus is going to be on autism spectrum disorder, which is just one type of neurodiversity. If you're not familiar, autism spectrum disorder is defined by kind of two things. Usually some sort of deficit in social interaction or communication. And what's most relevant for me is restricted and repetitive behavior patterns or interests. Autism is a spectrum, that's why it's called autism spectrum disorder. So this looks really different for any person. So there's a saying, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Because everybody's a little bit different in how this is presented. So for some individuals, it might be engaging in some sort of self-stimulatory behavior or stimming, like flapping their hands over and over again. They're being very repetitive with this behavior. Again, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with that, but that's what is being captured by this criterion. It could also range from maybe there's nothing abnormal in terms of our motor behavior, in terms of the way we move, but we only want to talk about trains or whatever your specific interest is. So it's going to have a wide variety in terms of how that presents, but that's the criterion that I'm most interested in understanding. Is one, where does that repetitive behavior come from, and can we teach more variable behavior? Importantly, especially with children, sometimes a lack of variability can be potentially problematic. So imagine if we have the child here who is lining up their cars instead of playing appropriately with the cars. Again, nothing inherently wrong with lining up your cars. However, other kids might be less likely to approach you and play with you in those cases. in which case you are going to miss out on some opportunities for social interaction, for learning about how to interact with other people. That's a huge part of what we learn when we are young and we're playing. It's also going to lead to fewer learning opportunities. So when we play, that has a lot of different functions for us, especially growing up. So as children, when we engage in play, we learn so much doing that. We learn gross motor skills, fine motor skills. We learn vocabulary. So you have a friend who says, "Can I have the red one?" And now you are learning what the word red means. Again, those social interactions, generally for our cognitive, for our development as a whole, play can be very beneficial. And the problem is if you have a child who's behaving too repetitively, they're not necessarily getting those opportunities. They might be losing out on some of those learning opportunities. So we don't necessarily need to stop the lighting up, we just need to expand what this child can do. So instead of only lighting up the cars, maybe sometimes they'll play more appropriately with the cars, they might play on the racetrack. That's going to allow them to interact with other people, so on and so forth. Okay. So this leads me into my area of research, and kind of my three main research questions that I'm going to talk about today are, first, can we teach variable play in autistic and neurotypical children? I'm going to talk about a little bit of both. And importantly, as I said, you don't necessarily always want to behave variably or always repetitively. So can we teach children to learn when it's better to behave variably and when it's better to behave repetitively? And if we can teach them these two different styles of play and when to do them, if we give them a choice, which would they prefer to do? Which type of play would they rather engage in? The first study I'm going to talk about is actually what I did for my dissertation. This was looking at choice for variable play, and my subjects were autistic preschoolers, males in this case. In both of the studies, I'm going to talk about two studies today, but in both the studies I'm going to talk about, we're using what's called a single case experimental design. And this might be a term, might be familiar for some of you, it might be unfamiliar. It's a less common experimental design in psychology. The type of experimental design that's usually used in psychology is something called a group design, where essentially we have Group A is our experimental group, they get whatever intervention. Group B is our control group, they don't. And so we make comparisons across groups, we average, we analyze that statistically. That's a great way to answer some questions. For the questions I'm interested in, it is actually better to use what's called a single case experimental design, which, as the name implies, technically you only need one participant, although we usually use more than one participant. Technically you only need one though, because each individual is essentially serving as their own control. They're going to experience every condition of this experiment. They're going to get the control condition, we call it baseline, in single case experimental design. And they're going to get the experimental condition. Sometimes we go back and forth, but we compare that individual to themselves instead of to other groups of people. And so for my work, this is the strategy that we tend to use more frequently. And if you have any questions afterwards about what exactly this means, I'd be happy to go into it for you. Okay. So for this study, I had 3 male preschoolers diagnosed with ASD. For confidentiality purposes, I have disguised their names, so those are their pseudonyms, not their real names. The materials that I used, I'm interested in play behavior, and so we used play sets and figurines. We also used something called a discriminative stimulus, which is just a signal. And in this case, we used colors. So we had cards of different colors, and we had, those little slap bracelets that you might have had when you were a kid that are different colors as well. And we used those as signals for when you should behave variably, when you should behave repetitively. We also used edible reinforcers. So when we gave reinforcement, we usually gave praise, but also had some sort of snack or candy or whatever it is that they wanted to work for that day. Our behavior of interest, our dependent variable, is play behavior, and so that is what we were measuring. Play behavior is very difficult to define, right? If you think about play, how do you define play? Well, this is certainly not all types of play. This is a very specific type of play. This is play with figurines on a play set. But we needed a very clear definition so that we could apply those lag schedules, and I'll get to that in a moment again. The way that we defined a play action was with three things. One, a figurine. So the child would have to pick up one of those figurines. They would have to make some sort of movement, so it wasn't enough to just place something somewhere. It had to move around, do something. And it had to be in some location on this play set. So this is the pirate ship. Some of our participants got the pirate ship. Some of them got other play sets, depending on their preferences. But for example, they might have the pirate, and they might make him rock the hammock, for instance. Or they might make the parrot jump off the plane. So lots of different behaviors that you could engage in, really almost an infinite kind of, because there's so many different movements that you can make. So tons of different behaviors that you can engage in. All right, so the way that this worked, we started with something called a preference assessment. We did that to try to figure out, in our first study, 2 play sets that were pretty equally preferred initially. And we did that because we're going to offer a choice later, and I want to make sure they're actually choosing based on the type of play, not based on which play set I've chosen. So initially, we identified 2 play sets that are pretty closely preferred. Then we have our baseline condition, and this is like the control condition in a single case design. And this is where we give them access to these play sets, but we don't give them any sort of prompts, any sort of instructions, and no reinforcers. So we just give them some access to see how they play without our help. And here is what some of our sessions look like. So you can see he's got a yellow card. That's what I meant by the stimuli. We go into the room. He's going to match it to the yellow bracelet and put that on. And his playset was a castle. And so this is his baseline. I have the video kind of sped up. But if you'll notice, he's basically taking every figurine, putting it through the same door over and over again. And eventually, he tends to spend most of his time doing those sorts of repetitive actions, or even sometimes just playing with the playset itself without the figurine, kind of those repeated actions. So this individual had a diagnosis of autism, and that's kind of typical what we would see in terms of baseline for this individual. The next step was to do what is called discrimination training. This is where we're going to try to teach when should you play variably, when should you behave repetitively. And we used these different colors as discriminative stimuli, so this is going to show blue in this case is, I think, was his variability condition. And you'll see in this case, in the other instance, there was only 1 bracelet on the wall. Now there's 2, a blue and a red. And we had to make sure that they could match the colors before they put it on. That way we know that they have actually looked at the color, because otherwise it would be very easy for them to be wearing this bracelet and never even look at it once. This way we can be sure that they actually looked at the color, that they were actually paying attention to it. 2 conditions, and we would alternate across sessions. So during a vary session, we used a lag schedule, where a play action had to be different than the previous one in order for us to reinforce it. So here's what that looked like for this individual. So you can see he's going to take one of the firefighters and slide them down the pole. He gets a little piece of a marshmallow for that. Then he's going to take a different firefighter, and you can't really see on that side, but there's a ladder. So he's going to make the fire person go up and down the ladder. Get some marshmallow for that too, because that's a different action. And he's very happy about this marshmallow. And then he's taking a different fire person and having them do a little flip there. So that would be an example of some variable play actions that he has learned to do. Now, this is after he's gotten quite a bit of training where we've only reinforced these variable actions. So he's gotten very, very good at this. So we could go in, and it took us several sessions to get here, though. So that's our vary condition. We also have a repeat condition, and this is where we teach more repetitive play behavior. And in this case, we have a different color, so if you'll notice he's wearing a red bracelet instead of blue this time. And it's a different play set too, it's a castle, so that you can tell these conditions apart a little bit easier. But again, before the experiment, we checked in the fire station and the castle were equally preferred for this child. And I know it's kind of hard to see there, but that was the action that he usually did. It's whatever the first action they did in that session, we just required them to keep doing that. And that's how they earned reinforcers. So there was a little knight and he was making it jump on the grass, and he just kept doing that over and over again. And that's exactly what we wanted for the repeat condition. I know there's a lot going on in these graphs, but what this is going to show us is the proportion of independent appropriate play actions that would have met a lag schedule. In other words, how variable is the play here. And you can see these are for the 3 different participants in this study. And you're going to see that there are some data points that are filled and some that are open. Filled are for the vary condition, open are for the repeat condition. And this is the baseline. So each one started with baseline first. For some of them, just a few sessions. For some of them, more. We had to wait till they were about the same before we can move on to our training. But you can see it's kind of all over the place. So for Jason, almost never did any variable play actions during baseline ever. Bruce did them sometimes, but then had some sessions where he didn't. Same kind of with Cole, kind of low levels of variability for both. This is discrimination training. This is where we're actually teaching and reinforcing variable behavior in the vary condition and repetitive play in the repeat condition. And as you would expect, what is showing us that our intervention is working is that the filled circles are much higher, indicating that more of their responses meet a lag schedule, more of their responses are variable. They're doing different things each time. And the open circles, you can see, are pretty much at 0 most of the time during training. And that's exactly what we would expect too, because they're not doing something different. They're doing the same thing kind of over and over again. Okay? So this shows us, yes, they can learn, vary your behavior when it's this color in this play set. Instead, repeat your behavior when it's this other color in this other play set. The last phase of this experiment was choice. So now that we were confident that they had learned how to play variably and how to play repetitively, we then wanted to know which one they would prefer to do if they were given that choice. So some research has shown actually that if you give, this has been done in college students a couple of times, pigeons a couple of times, it's really limited. But if you give a choice between behaving repetitively and behaving variably in like a really basic computer task, as long as it's not too hard of a variability requirement, we actually see that college students and pigeons would rather behave variably if they're given the choice, if everything else is equal. So seeing that, I was wondering if my hypothesis was that we would see the opposite, right? So for children diagnosed with autism who tend to behave more repetitively, if we offered them a choice, my guess is that they would choose to behave repetitively once we've taught them those things. All right, so this is what the choice condition looks like. And this is before every session. This is how he chose which snack he was going to work for in each one. So this time, instead of just one color on the door, there's 2. He picked red that time, which is repeat for him, and was the castle. And so when he picked that, we went in and we did a repeat session. And we gave him lots and lots of opportunities to make that choice to see which one he would choose more frequently. And this particular participant didn't seem to care, right? So you offer a choice, 50% of the time they choose variability, 50% of the time they choose repetition. And he sort of alternated. So this shows the total number of choices for each one, and this is just over time. So each time that they choose vary, the vary goes up. Each time they choose repeat, it goes up. And you can see it's right on top of each other, meaning it's pretty indifferent is what we would say to those 2 conditions. However, our other 2 participants showed something a little bit surprising, which was that when we offer them all these choices, most of the time they chose variability. So when we gave the choice between you can behave variably or you can behave repetitively, they actually chose the vary option. And we thought that this was really important because what it tells us is that, at least for those individuals, maybe they're behaving repetitively, not necessarily because they prefer repetition, but maybe just because they hadn't been adequately taught to behave variably yet. And once you sit them down and you teach them, here's how you can play variably, now that they have learned that, if you give them the option, at least a couple of them would prefer to do that. And that's really exciting because it means when we're trying to help these individuals, when we're trying to encourage variability, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to discourage repetition. It just might mean that we have to teach more variable responses, and then they might choose to do those. There's some limitations to this study, and that's going to lead me to talking about my next one, which is a limited participant sample. We had to use a lot of prompting to get this discrimination to happen, and we used those 2 play sets. That was my biggest issue with that study. And we did that so that they would learn that it would be easier to teach. Variable, repetitive, really different. However, there's always a chance that they weren't choosing variability, they were actually choosing whichever play set was assigned to variability. And so that was bugging me, and we did another study to try to address some of those limitations. This was an honors project done here by Paula Collette. She's like my superstar. She's graduated now. She's in optometry school, but she's amazing. This study was designed kind of as a follow-up, but we were really interested in what we would find with a neurotypical participant. So this is actually going to only show one subject because this is kind of just started, this area of research. But I wanted to share it with you because it was a very well-designed project, and Paula ran most of the sessions. She analyzed the data. She presented it at conferences. She wrote it up, and now we're trying to publish it. So just give it your all on your honors thesis because it might be something that you can present at conferences or get published. It can be very meaningful and substantial. All right, so the differences in the last study, the first one is a different type of participant. So instead of 3 male autistic preschoolers, we had 1 neurotypical female preschooler. We're going to call her Sally again for confidentiality reasons. We also used 1 playset instead of 2. So instead of having 1 playset for vary and 1 playset for repeat, we used the same playset for both. The only thing different was the colors. So that was it. And for the procedure, we used a little bit less prompting to see if we could get that same behavior with less of interference. So this is an example of Sally in the vary condition. So she's got obviously the pirate ship. She tried to get the pirate to launch the cannon, and she got a little snack for that. And let's see what else she does. Well, first, she was very interested in that catapult. But then she made the pirate walk up the stairs, and then she's going to take the parrot and have him sit on the ledge there, and she's taking the cat and having him move around in the crow's nest. So that's an example of a variable play session for Sally. Same play set, but now it's orange instead of blue as the placemat there, and her bracelet, which you can't really see. Well, you can see it on the other hand. But this is repeat. So we were requiring Sally to repeat the same play action to keep earning reinforcement. And her first play action of the session, of most of the sessions, was to make the pirate walk up the stairs. And so that was the action we were looking for. One thing you might notice is that even when she's behaving repetitively, she's still got a little bit more variation, whereas the one other participant that I showed you was just doing the same thing over and over and over again. She was having the pirate walk up the stairs and then jump over here, and then do a flip, and then spin the little wheel. So it was repetitive according to our definition, but it was still a little bit more variable than I was expecting to see. Anyway, these are her data. And so it's showing the same thing. This is how variable her play was in each condition. The filled circles are in the vary condition. What you might notice during discrimination training is that it's not quite as clean as the others. So with the others, we had very high levels of variability and very, very low levels in repeats. And that was a little bit more difficult here for a couple of reasons that I can talk about. Probably because we use the same play set, made it a little bit harder, and because we use less prompting. Her choice behavior is what was really interesting though. So when we did offer Sally a choice between these two conditions, she actually chose repeat more frequently. And that was surprising to us because we were expecting to see the total opposite. And we've got a lot of hypotheses about that, what that might, reasons that that might be, but we're going to have to repeat this with other participants to make sure this finding is replicable before we really get into explanations. But it was surprising. So we're not sure exactly why that is, but our goals for future research are to look at a wider variety of participants, more neurotypical participants, different types of diversity, different genders, different ages would be great. Figure out what procedural details we actually have to have in order to make them learn this a little bit better. And one interesting thing, we want to see how this will actually generalize to other settings. In the first study that I showed you, one of the therapists that worked with one of the participants told us, so this is anecdotal, but that outside of the research sessions, they were actually starting to play a lot more variably with their toys. And that was really interesting. I'd like to look at that more systematically. All right, that's what I got. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Utah State and, of course, here at MTSU in the Translational, Experimental, and Applied Behavior Analysis Lab, and Paula Collette, who did the Sally study as her honors project. Questions? Or thoughts? Go ahead.
So I kind of have a lot. So
Okay.
you can shut me down if it's
Okay.
I wanted to ask, do you have any theories on the consideration of like adaptive play or learned play, reinforcing it, like adhering to something similar to a critical period with like hearing development?
I have not thought about hearing development specifically. My inclination is probably that you would get a lot of important hearing development happening during those play processes, and so playing more variably might help there, but I'm not sure.
But more so I was thinking like specifically like a relationship, not direct, but like would there be a critical period for learning variable play?
I see, so like age, you mean? I don't know, that's a very good question. I do know that studies have shown that we can reinforce variability at all ages. So you can do this with adults, you can do this with older children. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not better to intervene younger.
Right, like with dyslexia.
Absolutely. And so we might see better outcomes, better long-term outcomes if we intervene younger. However, we know that we can make some changes throughout the lifespan.
Okay.
Great question. Yeah.
I want to ask, what made you decide to focus on specifically ASD and younger child development for those who have it? My brother James is on the spectrum where he'll be underneath me and my family's care for the rest of his life. So I'm just curious what motivated you to look more into that.
What motivated me was that when I was a college student, I started working as a therapist for individuals on the autism spectrum. And I didn't really know much about autism before I started that, but I completely loved it. And it totally changed what I was going to. First, I was going to go on to grad school in neuroscience, but instead I wanted to, because of these experiences, I wanted to go on in behavior analysis. Applied behavior analysis is something that is very commonly used with autism. So it was those experiences, just working with the kids, seeing the kind of progress that you can make. That was really what got me into it, and I obviously haven't stopped being interested. Never will. Yes.
Would you say that it would be beneficial for parents and teachers to encourage and reward variable play versus repetition, or is it something that should generally be kind of like hands off, let them do their own, or is it better to step in and encourage those behaviors?
Very good question. So what we do know is in a lot of cases you don't have to intervene specifically in order to get variable play. So with a lot of kids, without any kind of special intervention, we do see variable play develop. However, because we don't see it with everybody, if I were a parent, I would err on the side of, why not? Let's teach some variable play. And that is going to set the child up kind of for the best possible outcome. So if they do have some difficulty learning variable play, then I'm supporting them doing that. So that would be my perspective.
And another one, do you think there is a significant effect of gender on the way that they present ASD symptoms, deal with them, masking, those kinds of things? Do you think gender really would affect these studies a lot?
Absolutely. So it's very well documented. Generally, males are more likely to be diagnosed with autism than females, and recently we've started trying to figure out, why that is. And one of the most prominent explanations for that is that autism just looks different for girls in some cases. So those symptoms might present a little bit differently, meaning they're not caught, and so we are missing diagnoses, right?
Yeah, because that actually happened with my family. My brother's diagnosed. And then years and years later, because I got tested when I was really young, years and years later, now they're like, actually, we think you're probably on the spectrum. And I'm like, now an adult. And a similar thing happened with my best friend. Her little brother at a very young age was diagnosed. She was just diagnosed 2 years ago. So I find that kind of interesting when it comes to the research field, if there should be more focus and consideration when it comes to gender, and kind of what discrepancies are going on there. So that's interesting to me.
Absolutely. I think more needs to be looked at in terms of that. And from a research perspective, purely for logistical reasons, it makes our job a lot harder, because if I want to get a more diverse sample, it's really hard in certain settings. Most of the kids in most of the daycares and clinics where I've been able to get participants, most are male. And so if I'm looking for participants, the majority are going to be male, and that's going to bias my sample. And so I think it's something that as a society we are starting to be able to deal with a little bit better. You talked about masking, things like that. We're more aware of these things. The diagnostic criteria are becoming a little bit more inclusive over time. So I'm hopeful that things are changing, but you're right, there's a big disparity.
Yeah, because with retrospect to my childhood and life, I can see how I was kind of presenting things when I was little and learned to shut that down and kind of mask through, honestly, mostly socialization with other kids and being made fun of and all that. Learned to just we're gonna curtains down on that one.
It's a very common experience, and it's unfortunate because outcomes tend to be better the earlier that you can intervene. And so if we can make those diagnoses younger, there's a lot more that we can do to help improve life in the long term. Yes.
In regards to your exclusion criteria and kind of your controls, did you exclude children that had dyspraxia or were nonverbal, or were the commands verbal? Were they already tested for central auditory processing disorder?
Very good question. So what we were looking for, we didn't have any specific, if they have these other diagnoses, it's excluded. They simply had to have a diagnosis of autism for the first study. And for the second study, we've been recruiting a variety of participants and kind of giving them a questionnaire to see, would we classify them more as autism or more neurotypical? One thing we were looking at was, can they follow basic instructions so that we can basically instruct to sit down. We don't give very many instructions during the sessions. It's more we use the reinforcers to communicate. So they don't necessarily have to be advanced in terms of verbalization, but they do need to be able to follow some basic instructions so that we can do the study, obviously. And they also had to, during an inclusion-exclusion session, we gave them a different play set, and if they approached it, if they touched it at least once, they were eligible. For some students, they never approached it, they never touched it. For others, they did approach it and they were playing super variably all the time. And so those individuals we did exclude. Good question. Yes?
Was there any found or hypothesized significance in whether the participant repeatedly picked either variability or repetition once they got to the chosen stage?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Was there any found or hypothesized significance in chosen variability or repetition once it got to the stage of picking one or the other?
Yeah, do you mean like for a certain individual?
Right.
Could I make some determination about their preferences?
Like if one individual is repeatedly choosing variable play, is that significant in terms of their preference as a whole, I guess? I don't know exactly
Maybe.
how to word my question.
One thing that I think might sort of answer your question a little bit, I am really interested in generalization. So their choices here in this study tell me when it's a play set and there's figurines, they probably prefer variable play if they're choosing variable play. I don't know if that applies to imaginary play with their friends, or whether it applies to playing with race cars, that different types of play. I don't know if this would generalize, and I think that that's an important area of research that I would like to do more of, to see if it does generalize. Yes?
Can this study be replicated with different areas, like eating different foods, watching different movies, or using different words in daily life?
Yeah, people have definitely shown that we can reinforce more variable responding on a lot of those things. I don't actually know food specifically if that's been done. I'd have to check on that. I know requests for different foods, but I don't know about like trying new foods. But like choosing what sort of movie to watch or what activity to engage in, that's been done. However, they haven't really done the kind of preference test that I did. So they've shown, yes, we can encourage more variable responding or more variable choices there. We still don't know necessarily which they would prefer, whether they would prefer to choose more repetitively or choose variably. That option hasn't necessarily been tested for, and I would like to see that done more in future research, because I think it's really useful to know if what we're doing is preferable or not for our clients and participants.
Okay, that brings us to time. So join me in thanking Dr. Galizio.